Gotten up for a glass of water around midnight and happened to glance through the kitchen window toward the road. The cemetery was partially visible from that angle, the white gate catching the moonlight and the stones arranged in their uneven rows behind it. And moving among them, slowly, was a dark figure dressed in a cape. Welcome to the Night Visitors, where we share purportedly true accounts of interactions with vampires and other supernatural predators. I'm James, a paranormal researcher and lifelong vampire enthusiast, coming to you from Transylvania. The following is a true story with names and identifying details changed to protect the privacy of those involved. I spent a few years in my early 20s doing substitute teaching. It was a job that I really enjoyed and that gave me the opportunity to meet many interesting people. One of my favorite placements was at an alternative school for kids who didn't quite fit within the normal school system, many of whom had criminal records and came from difficult family situations. I found both the students and teachers at the school to be a wonderful mix of people that I got along with very well. One person that I met and befriended there was an English teacher named Veronica, who, like me, had an interest in all things supernatural. She shared the following account with me that she experienced firsthand over the summer of 1998 with an entity that she believed to be a vampire when she was house-sitting at a property in rural Massachusetts close to the New Hampshire border. The house in question sat across a narrow country road from a cemetery. It belonged to friends of hers who were university professors that had gone on sabbatical. Veronica was very happy with the arrangement. She intended to lock herself in the house with a massive stack of books and tend the garden in the backyard. The property was old, a white clapboard colonial that had probably been standing there since before the Revolution, and the location was extremely rural without a neighbor in sight. The cemetery across the road was similarly old. The graves nearest the wrought iron gate dated from the late 1700s. Some of the stones were so weathered that the names had dissolved into the granite and were no longer legible. It was the kind of cemetery that had a melancholy dignity to it, not neglected, but wild at the margins in the way old things that have not been tended to for a very long time have grown accustomed to being left mostly alone. For the first several weeks, Veronica noticed nothing unusual. She woke early, drank her coffee on the porch, drove into town for groceries, and spent the long summer evenings reading. She slept well. The only sounds at night were the usual sounds of a wooded rural property, a creek somewhere behind the tree line, the wind through the oaks, and occasionally the distant sound of a car moving along the state road a mile away. Everything was quiet and peaceful. It was sometime in mid-July when she first saw him. She had gotten up for a glass of water around midnight and happened to glance through the kitchen window toward the road. The cemetery was partially visible from that angle, the white gate catching the moonlight and the stones arranged in their uneven rows behind it. And moving among them, slowly, was a dark figure dressed in a cape. Not a coat, a cape, with a high collar and a hem that fell nearly to his boots. She stood at the kitchen window for what felt like a long time, watching him move between the stones, pausing occasionally at one grave and then another, before he disappeared into the darkness at the far end of the cemetery, and did not come back into view. Veronica told me that she stood there for a little while longer than what was strictly necessary to confirm that he was gone. Then she went back to bed and slept the better part of the next morning, convincing herself that there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe he was a local eccentric, but harmless. The cape was odd, but not impossible. Artsy, eccentric people often wore unusual things. She had spent too many years in faculty meetings to be easily startled by eccentricity. But she saw him again 4 nights later, and then again the following week. And each time the pattern was the same. He appeared sometime after dark, dressed in the same cape, moving slowly among the graves with that unhurried, proprietary ease. And he was always gone before dawn. She noticed two things about his appearances that she could not quite rationalize away. The first was the owls. She had heard them occasionally in the weeks before. A single great horned owl somewhere in the woods was not unusual. But on the nights he appeared, they were louder, more agitated, calling back and forth from different points in the tree line with a furious insistence. And from somewhere across the fields, on those same nights, and only on those nights, she would hear dogs. Not one dog, but several. Their howling starting almost simultaneously and then rising and falling in intensity. The second thing she noticed was that he cast no light. Not in the sense that he didn't carry a flashlight, but that his figure seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. The gravestones around him caught the light and glowed amidst the surrounding darkness. He did not. He moved through the cemetery like a shadow that had decided to take a more intentional shape. It was a night in early August when she saw the fire. She had woken around 2 in the morning to the smell of smoke, faint but definite. And when she went to the front window, she saw a small fire burning in the center of the cemetery, low and controlled, throwing an orange light that made the surrounding stones look amber and warm. He was there, standing at the edge of the fire. He was moving in a slow, deliberate circle, his arms extended slightly from his side, his head bowed, his lips moving in something she could not hear. There was an intentionality to it that was entirely different from his previous nighttime wandering. This was not a walk. This was a spiritual working, a ritual. Veronica stood at the window watching him. When the fire died down and he was done, he stood still for a moment facing the house, facing her window. And though she couldn't have said from that distance whether he was actually looking at her, she stepped back from the glass. She picked up the telephone. She put it back down. What would she say? That a man in a cape was conducting what appeared to be some kind of ceremony in a cemetery in the middle of the night? Cemeteries were technically public spaces, or close enough to it. He wasn't breaking into the house. He wasn't threatening her, at least not in any way she could articulate to a dispatcher in under 2 minutes. She was a practical woman. She was not in the habit of calling the police over things she couldn't prove. She drove into town the next morning and bought a substantial quantity of garlic, and that evening she braided what she could into loose bunches and hung them over the back door and the front door and the 2 windows on the ground floor that were closest to the road. It felt, she said, both ridiculous and entirely necessary, which is a feeling she had come to associate over the years with correct decisions. The brick dust was the idea of a woman she had met during her undergraduate years, a classmate who majored in anthropology and who had grown up in New Orleans, and who Veronica called on the off chance that she would not be laughed at. She wasn't. Her friend told her about the practice. Red brick dust, ground from unfired clay brick, spread in a thin line across every threshold, doors and windows both, as a boundary against harm, a tradition with roots in West African spiritual practice that had come into hoodoo and root work, and had been used for generations by people who understood the difference between the world that presented itself in the daylight and the world that moved at its edges. "You laid the line with intention," her colleague told her. "You knew what you were keeping out when you did it." Veronica went to 3 hardware stores before she found clay bricks. She ground a portion of one with a hammer and a flat stone in the backyard, the work taking almost the entire afternoon. And then she laid the dust carefully across every threshold in the house: the front door, the back door, the door to the basement, each of the ground floor windows, moving with a slowness that she described as prayerful, though she wasn't sure she believed in prayer in any conventional sense. He came again 2 nights later. She watched from the upstairs window this time, staying back from the glass. He moved through the cemetery in his usual way, pausing at one grave for a long time. The owls were loud and the dogs were howling from somewhere across the dark fields. Her last night at the house was the 23rd of August. She had been planning to stay through the end of the month to give the house a final cleaning and pick up the last of the garden before her friends returned. But that changed on the evening of the 23rd, which was warm and still and had that particular quality of late summer in New England that has something magical about it, something that acknowledges the season is nearly over, even as it offers up its warmest colors. She had been sitting on the porch watching the daylight fade when the mist came. This was not unusual for that area. There was water in the ground there. The fog gathered in the low places of the cemetery most evenings in late summer, rising from the earth slowly, pooling around the bases of the older stones. But this fog moved differently. It rose in a single column from a spot near the center of the cemetery, thicker than the mist around it, coherent in a way that mist normally is not. And as the dusk deepened, and as the last of the light went horizontal through the trees, the column condensed and darkened, and the darkness gathered itself into a shape, and the shape was him. He did not step out from behind a tree. He did not come through the gate. He rose out of the ground as fog and coalesced into his own form. The cape, the tall collar, the clasped hands, the stillness, as though he had always been there and was simply choosing now to be seen. Veronica did not go back into the house for her things. She got in her car with only her keys and her purse, and she drove. She called her friends from her mother's house 2 towns over to explain that she'd had to leave early, and she gave a reason that was not the true reason. They were gracious about it, and she never went back. I've thought about what she described many times since the day she told me this story almost 20 years ago. The cape, the fire, the ceremony she witnessed from across the road. There are possible interpretations that don't require us to delve into the supernatural. There are people who practice ceremonial magic in rural places, and cemeteries have been sites of ritual across a great many traditions. But there is the question of how he arrived on that last evening, rising out of the mist in the gathering darkness like a thing that belongs to the earth rather than the world that exists on its surface. For that, I can find no mundane explanation. I hope you have enjoyed tonight's episode. If you believe you have encountered a vampire and would like to share your experience, please contact me at thenightvisitorsvrs@gmail.com. If you happen to be viewing this on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for listening. A special thanks to composer Tim Kulig for our intro music, Haunted House. You can find The Night Visitors on your favorite podcast platform and thenightvisitors.com. You can also subscribe to our newsletter where you will receive each week's episode directly in your inbox, as well as articles on vampire lore and vampires in popular culture.